Stanford University.
More accessible. Today we have Nathan Shedroff from the California College of Arts, who's an instructor and director there.
I run the design MBA program there.
You run the MBA program, the design MBA program. And Chris Noessel from Cooper Design.
Yep, I'm the director, one of the two directors of interaction design there.
Welcome, guys.
Okay, we're going to jump right in. We have tons that we could share, and we just don't have that much time, but it should be a lot of fun. What we've been doing for the last almost 4 years now is doing a deep dive into science fiction to see what kind of interface lessons we could pull out of interfaces that we see in science fiction, mostly films and television. So some of what we found is that these two media, the real-time design and technology, are influencing science fiction and vice versa. And we've found a lot of lessons that are applicable for interaction designers that are doing real-world work as opposed to fictional work. It's probably worth saying in the beginning that by design here, we're going to use the word as a shorthand. We're really talking about design that has to be visual, or else we can't see what's going on. It has to be, what we're really talking about is interaction design or interface design. So we're not looking at technology, we're not looking at like whether a transporter is possible or not. We're looking at mostly the interaction, and there's sometimes physical aspects to that, but a lot of it ends up being screen-based.
So whereas when we talk about design, we're talking about interface design. That's what our interest is. It's what our background is. The other giant big word that we're playing with here is sci-fi, which is a gigantic field. So what do we mean when we say sci-fi? We do mean something very specific. And like Nathan said, we're looking at interfaces, which means that the very first thing we cut is it's got to be visual. Yep, we've got to be able to see it. Sure, we can see Vern to sort of describe the time machine, but he says, oh, so-and-so pulls a lever. Where is that lever? How long is it? Does it move forward or backwards? When we evaluate interfaces, we kind of have to know that information. So our first cut is visual, and your favorite literature will not be represented here. Save the tomatoes for the end. The second thing is that we need to see these interfaces in motion, which means that you're not going to see your favorite graphic novels represented, or even like concept art that's just all out. And the last sort of cut we have about what sci-fi is that it's got to be constant. And really that kind of means consistent from depiction to depiction. So we don't have to talk about, well, the sci-fi interface in version 1 of this is this way, and the interface in version 3 of this is that way. It's way too complex. So we're actually cutting out hand-drawn animation. I know, curses. But 3D animation is in because it's harder to, you have to deliberately change that. So anyway, we don't have a lot of these examples, but so generally what that leaves us with is screen sci-fi, either on the television or movies. And then we looked out at sort of
like industrial films and other forms of speculative fiction in industry, in the commercial world. If it's possible to bring the lights down, it's really hard to see the screen. We'd rather you see the screen than us, if possible.
You've seen us. We don't change over the course of the presentation.
But we should keep going.
Oh, I think they're over here, right?
They're doing it.
Oh, magically. Awesome.
Nice.
Okay. So that's sort of what we mean by design and what we mean by sci-fi. And in fact, our work is about sort of what lessons interface designers can pull out of that stuff. But what we did to pull these lessons out is we first went and we watched a lot of science fiction. Now, not too hard of a problem. We're both kind of fanboys. But in full disclosure, he's the Star Trek fan and I'm the Star Wars fan. And what we did is we screen capped all the interfaces that we could find from them. And we put that into a giant database.
It's probably safe to say that we haven't hit everything, although we've hit a lot in 4 years. But we haven't hit a lot of the standards from the UK. So we haven't gotten to Doctor Who, the zillion versions of it, and not things like Blake 7, and haven't hit Space 1999. But most of the American properties we have.
I got just the medical bit from Space 1999.
There you go.
And so what we did is we put them in a giant online database where we did things like described them and then tagged them. Then we took a look at the giant tag cloud that emerged. One of my favorite things about it is that the biggest lesson from sci-fi is that it glows. So you know you're looking at sci-fi if you're looking at a tech that glows, which actually instantly made me try and think of a story where tech doesn't glow. But okay, so and then what we did is once we had that tag, is we could open up an individual tag and then play around with those interfaces and see what came out of it. Then we had to use our design expertise in order to apply lessons to it. So the big work is about lessons. Today's talk is just about a small part of that, which is about the lines of influence between science fiction and design. Yep. And we found that there are 6 main ways. The first main way is this ring of sort of individual inspiration. Of course, sci-fi and design aren't monoliths. They're not the weather. They just don't occur. People make them. And so we do have collected stories about people who are doing interface design being influenced by sci-fi and people making sci-fi who are influenced by what they see in the real world. That's sort of the inner ring. Then when we talk about how the real world interfaces sci-fi, this is one of my pithier statements, so I'll say it twice, that the real world establishes the paradigm that science fiction extends. The real world establishes the paradigm that science fiction extends. We'll get into examples to sort of back that statement up. It shouldn't be too controversial. And then there are 3 main ways that sci-fi ends up influencing the types of design we make or that we can make. The first way is by setting audience expectation. Hey, what's coming? What do we expect to come in the future? The second way is by reminding us that there is a human in the side of the human-computer interaction, and that human side probably will not change. And then, of course, there is the proposed paradigm, which talks about the interface side, and this says, yes, technology will change, and how do we connect that to the basic human involved, or alien.
Or animal, yeah.
Yep. Okay, so we're going to dive in. We're going to talk about sort of this first arc, and we're going to start looking at videos, so I may actually ask the video to go down a little farther. The lights to go down a little farther so that we can see the video well.
The first one should be okay.
Yeah, we should be okay. Okay, so what we did to sort of establish this tenet that design establishes the paradigm that science fiction extends is we went back all the way in time to try and find connections, examples of interfaces across time. So the first one we have is all the way back in the early days of cinema. If you haven't seen it, it's La Voyage dans la Lune by the Lumiere brothers in 1902. Now the weird thing about this little clip is what we're about to see is that there are no interfaces. Largely because the audience was operating in a mechanistic paradigm. Yep. If you wanted to push a door, as you'll see, if you want to open a door, you just push the door. If you want to send a rocket to the moon, you stick it in a giant gun and fire it.
The funny thing is there's not even a door handle here.
No, there's not a door handle.
No affordances.
And to be fair, it's a piece of theater that was committed to a camera.
The cannon is loaded. The breech is closed. Everyone is anxiously waiting for the signal, which starts the shell on its voyage. The officer gives the signal. The gun is fired, and the shell sees the eye of the...
And I'll pause there because a lot of people recognize that. Okay, so, yeah, and yes, that's where it's from. So that we don't see any interfaces there. But if we jump ahead to the sort of next serious take at science fiction, we hit Fritz Lang's masterpiece Metropolis, which is in 1927. Yes, I'm checking my facts by screen. But in this scene, if you're not familiar with the film, Joe Fredersen is approaching this giant communication device that's mounted to the wall. And what we'll see him do is he checks his messages, and then he sees a message from Grot in the lower city, and then he calls Grot and has a conversation with him. The thing I want to draw your attention to as we watch the clip is how he sort of changes the channels on the device.
So his messages come in as ticker tape.
Turns it on, it appears in steps, and then he tunes the channel in. Once he's done tuning, he picks up a telephone, beeps a little light manually that blinks down in the lower city. Grot says, oh, and he's a fabulous actor. Yeah, I love Grot. I'm going to pause there sort of in the interest of time, but it goes on for a bit, and the way he hangs up is actually finishes the call is actually just to hang up, and it ends on both sides. If we jump ahead and look at a similar interface from only 15 years later, Buck Rogers in 1939, did I say 12 years later, we see a similar interface. It's a giant video screen in a wall, but let's pay attention to how this user changes the channels on this device.
Will Coleman Rogers must prevail on the Saturnians to lend them a spaceship to return to Earth.
That's no Saturnian craft, Doctor. It's one of Killer Kane's spaceships.
Impossible.
I know that type of ship too well to be mistaken. Have you tried to contact them on our wavelength?
As a matter of fact, I haven't.
Oh, we must do so at once.
So charmingly, they have to go into another room for the audio.
There's a spaceship at 2.
But as we saw that in the first one, they had to sort of tune the channel, and in the second one, they simply turned a knob. Well, what happened in between was television. Yep, audiences suddenly had experience with the technology that they could understand that, oh yeah, it's not going to be like tuning a radio. It will be a discrete channel that I will turn and I will feel that knob. Suddenly the storytellers had easy access to a paradigm that they could build upon. Oh, you know what TV is? This is just a giant TV. Don't worry about it. And of course we're still in silent film, and that's, I think, why they had to go into another room for audio. But
well, and on top of that, the first example there, or rather the second example, was this mixing of metaphors. You had the ticker tape, and then you had this sort of radio metaphor. And in order to tell the story, they had to use media metaphors that were understood by the audience, right? So they do this sort of strange, what we see as a quaint mix now. Again, you see the same problem with Flash Gordon. People weren't attuned to something like a television being a two-way communication device. They had radio rooms, especially in the military, so it was natural for them to sort of see things in one place and then have to go to another place to have a phone call or radio call. And to us, it looks really quaint and weird and funny, but that was what audiences knew. And the filmmakers just can't step too far out, especially then, in telling the story, or else it'll derail the story because it'll leave audiences confused. And lest you think that this is just sort of quaint old media, here we have Jurassic Park from what, 91? 93? Famous scene. I'm sure all of you grew up with.
I don't know. I know as you did.
It's all the files of the whole park. It tells you everything. I gotta find the right file.
Trying to reach the gun!
I can't get it unless I
Exciting.
So I paused it here for a reason. It's important to the filmmakers to sort of do this cutaway that really doesn't have a lot of meaning, because certainly as computer users, we know how she's controlling a graphic user interface. Personal computers were around for most people, but not necessarily personal computers with mice and graphic user interfaces. So this is actually a necessary part of the filmmaking or the storytelling within film, because they have to help the audience understand what's going on here, or else the audience gets sort of left behind asking questions and it derails the narrative. We see this over and over in science fiction.
So we're still building on the existing paradigm. And hopefully we will have demonstrated in that short amount of time that that assertion is true. Now we'll dive in for a couple of just quick individual inspiration stories. These become more anecdotes, but they're always charming anecdotes. And based on the Jurassic Park example, it's still really hard to see video. So am I going to get in trouble if I turn off the lights?
We can.
You got it?
No, yes,
Awesome.
you are. Yeah.
Okay, cool.
One of the problems with science fiction is it's often really dark.
It's really dark.
Which is why you see things glow.
Yeah, exactly.
But it's really hard to show here.
So in this case, we're going to take a look at, again, sort of individual inspirations from the real world and how it affected sci-fi. In this particular example, if you're not familiar with it, the Visible Human Project, circa 1989, asked for volunteers from prisoners to donate their bodies to science. Those prisoners were then frozen. Sliced is the best way to tell it, but in fact they were shaved. And then each of those slices were documented in a giant online database that you can go in and play and move through a human body. And in fact, this little bit that we see here is a particular slice in the very bottom of this particular human. So you can see sort of the meaty bits of the foot and just the beginning of the toe on the, am I orienting right? I think the left foot.
Right.
This is a really beautiful project, and we think so, and somebody at Fox Studios also thought so. Here's I put the video in. Awesome. I forgot. So here we are moving through that human body. Kind of a beautiful thing, and it had never been done before and gave us insights to the structure of the human body that we hadn't seen. But somebody at Fox sort of was inspired by the exact same thing. In this scene from X2, the second X-Men movie, there's a guard bringing something into Magneto, and of course he's got to go through a metal scanner before he can go in. There he is being scanned. Does that look familiar? It should look really familiar because it's the exact same image. Yeah. Oh yeah, colored blue. That is actually another, of all the colors, if you want to know in the tag cloud, blue is the strongest color. So blue, sci-fi is blue and glows.
So that was an individual example of individual inspiration from the real world by one production designer or one director into sci-fi world. Here's another one, not coming from the world of technology, but coming from the world of art. So Damien Hirst, a fairly very well-known artist and a fairly controversial one at times. This is from a series back in what, 96 we think, yeah. Of sort of sliced animals in formaldehyde. And in the movie The Cell, I don't know how many people have ever seen the movie The Cell with J-Lo, and it's actually an incredibly beautifully constructed movie. And so there's a scene here, go ahead, and we see something really familiar.
This is in a nightmare world, by the way.
Yeah, she's in the head of a serial killer, which we'll get in a second. I love the neigh. Okay, so look familiar. This is probably more less of a ripoff and more of an homage. And they sort of do Damien Hirst one better because, of course, Damien Hirst's real animals are dead, but this is all CGI, so you can see the heart's pumping and it's breathing, and the animal is still quote unquote alive.
Skin fat, sort of subcutaneous fat, leaving slime trails.
So we see a lot of this. We see individual production designers and directors find something in the real world and apply it in sort of a new way. But it's fairly limited in terms of both its influence and the amount of time it occurs.
So if we zoom sort of back out, we're going to leave off that stuff. Hopefully we've proven beyond the shadow of a doubt that design sort of establishes this paradigm that sci-fi builds on. Since we're in this sort of realm of individual inspiration, we're now going to go the other route and talk about one of my favorite examples from our work comes when sci-fi influenced the real world, so the opposite direction. In this case, it centers around a fellow by the name of Douglas Caldwell, who was successfully petitioned by his teenage son to go watch the X-Men movie. Now, Doug's not a sci-fi fan, he confessed to me, but he did want to sort of have that bonding moment with his son, so he said, sure, son, let's go to the movies. To his surprise, in the middle of the film, he found the solution to a 2,000-year-old problem that he had been facing at work.
Magneto is here, Liberty Island. Now, presumably, his objective is to mutate the world leaders at the UN summit on Ellis Island.
He doesn't know his machine kills. And judging from what the professor saw, if Magneto gave Rogue enough power, he could wipe out everyone in New York City.
Did I go
All
off
right,
the bridge?
we can insert here at the George Washington Bridge.
There it is.
Oh, there we go.
I love pausing in this one because that's technically impossible given the pin.
Well, that's not if it's all magnetically controlled, right?
Yeah, well, then it should be Magneto's device.
This is a technological argument more than anything else.
So the reason that this scene was so fascinating to Douglas is that he worked for the U.S. Army topographical engineers. His job is to model the potential theater of war, build a 3D model, and ship that out to generals in the field. Turns out it's really efficient to think on a big playing board rather than on maps.
And it's wonderfully, these things are still called sand tables, even though they're not, they're models now.
Problem with Doug's job is that it's very error prone, it's very expensive, and if you get the wrong theater of war, you're kind of screwing over human lives. So what he saw in this film was, holy cow, a way to represent any topography at any time across the entire world.
At any scale.
So he took this scene from X-Men, wrote up an RFP, found a company, and within 4 years had the Xenotran. The Xenotran is the Mark IV device, and you can actually see here it's an array of computer-controlled pins that respond up and down. They did it one better, though. This sort of thin rubber sheet can sort of clamp down on top of the pins and then get vacuum sealed, and then they project satellite imagery on top. So they get actually a really good sort of image of what the world is like. I think I have a video of it that's silent so we can talk over it. And this one is just sort of showing the satellite image and the rubber getting sucked down on top of the topography. But they also did things like they modeled the tsunami waves in the Philippines. They've modeled the surface of Mars and ancient battlefields like Antioch. So really fascinating project and a direct result of what he went to see in X-Men. I've since spoken with the art director of X-Men, and he said that Bryan Singer came up with the idea for the pin table from being at the mall one day and playing with one of those pin things that you can move your hand and face under.
So this is a pretty extraordinary moment, actually. So here's the U.S. military inserting into a request for a proposal on military equipment a scene from a science fiction film, which is the inspiration for where this came from, and then revisiting it with his contractors repeatedly until they had sort of what they wanted.
Yeah, they watched the film during the course of the making of this thing. Like, oh, there's the scene. Oh, that's how they did it. And then I think that's when they realized that the bridge was impossible for them anyway.
Excellent. So one of the other ways that science fiction is influencing the real world is that it's setting expectations for not just audiences, but for engineers, designers, production designers, directors, etc. So here's a really good example. This isn't the first robot in science fiction, but it's one of the most iconic. This is 1951. Gort. We don't really have to see a whole lot more than that. We have a lot more film clips anyway. So this is a really important moment sort of in science fiction, because now this is the beginning of how robots have become into our culture. The first robot was Maria in Metropolis in the 20s, late 20s, early 30s. Yep. But this, essentially this film sort of kicked off the whole robot wave of popular culture, and it set expectations for the fact that we should have devices, we should have technology, we should have machines that look like people. We see it in, I'm actually going to, well, we might as well see it here. This has been going on for 60 years or so.
Good morning, sir.
Sometimes they're just annoying. Sometimes they're powerful. And this is sort of the state of the art. It's no longer exactly the state of the art. This is 2005, of where robots are in the lab. So this is Osimo from Honda. And this, to me, is really interesting because, you know, Osimo's prime job here that's being displayed is to deliver coffee down a hallway, right? So if you wanted to deliver coffee down a hallway, you wouldn't need all this technology. We're talking about billions of dollars being directed into robot development, specifically with this sort of humanistic, bilateral symmetry, humanoid-like, not only visual, but physical capability. Most industrial robots, in fact, do we have a, no we don't. We used to have a picture of an industrial robot is, you've probably seen them around. I think there's one in the lobby. They're sort of robot arms. They don't look anything humanoid. They don't have to, because most of the robots that are used in commercial use are very specialized. They don't need to look like people. But in popular culture and then in society, we have this need for robots to get humanish, evidenced by Osimo and all the other robots that follow in his lineage, both before and after. And that's coming right from science fiction. That's coming from our expectations about what this technology should do. We'll go back here. Keep going forward. Another example of where science fiction is setting expectations. This is 1966. Remember that date?
Suddenly it went dead. No static, just nothing.
Kirk to Enterprise. Scotty.
Hands it to IT.
Nothing wrong with the communicator, sir.
So at least we know AT&T survives until the 24th century. So 1966, exactly 30 years later to the year, we have the StarTAC communicator, also known as a mobile phone. It's the first flip phone, and it has exactly the same form factor. And if you talk to, certainly in the lore of the development of this phone on the Motorola team of engineers, they kept referencing the Star Trek communicator constantly as what their goal was. That's sort of the picture of the, at the time, certainly in 96, that was their ideal communicator. Why? Because they had lived with it for 30 years. They grew up with this as an iconic example of what mobile communications could be or should be. And built into that also was 30 years worth of sort of audience test case validation, because the audience is expecting that this is a natural movement and this is an appropriate communication device. So science fiction has not only set the expectations in terms of the engineers that are developing these technologies and these products, but they're also setting the expectations in the audience as well. You could make a case for, this is a little bit shakier ground, here's 87 with, it is 87, yeah, exactly. Star Trek Next Generation having these pads, and of course these were back in the original series as well, and they had sort of a stylus, and they were a big bulky thing, but they became much thinner in Next Generation, and surprisingly similar, and this is another specialized version of one, but surprisingly similar to what we see in tablet computing now. Again, a natural progression, at least in the minds of people who've been watching Next Generation and other related science fiction for many years. This is already sort of a pre-accepted technology form. And this is even on shakier ground, but...
No, I assert it's true. I think they put it there to train us.
Chris, well, then tell us.
No, I mean, just like if the Star Trek example was two different arms, sort of trying to like, hey, look what they did. Let's mimic it. But I think Apple's doing it deliberately.
So Chris contends that Apple slid this example into a Pixar film, in this case The Incredibles, back in 2004, just a few years before the first iPad came out, purposefully trying to get people used to it. Here's a clip from it.
The only difference is the lenticular screen.
Exactly. Still working on that. And of course, this is really where all of this is an example here on the right of the sort of original mobile tablet device from Star Trek and what we were looking at before then. Another way that science fiction is influencing real-world development is by both setting and playing with social context. So the first good example of this is all around anthropomorphism, and we see a lot of interesting things around anthropomorphism. I'm sure that you've seen some of these examples. We have Clippy and Bob, neither of which were terribly successful products. In fact, triggered a great deal of emotional reaction. Maybe that's a good way to put it. And what's interesting is that these examples, and the lower one on the right here is Ms. Dewey, which was an animated character front end to a search engine. And it was an experiment that Microsoft did several years ago. It didn't last very long. We were lucky to get a screenshot at all. And what these examples show is that this is a really difficult thing to pull off. And of course, this is all based on research that was done right here at Stanford, just a few buildings over, much of it by Cliff Nass and Byron Reeves. And it's not that this research is bad or anthropomorphism in the interface is bad. What these examples show is that it's really hard to do. Because once you start playing with it, you raise expectations about what the system's capable of, and very often those expectations just aren't deliverable in the technology that we're using. So it becomes tricky to pull off well. In this particular case, it was very interesting because it was as if Microsoft didn't even try to do it well here. And I say that because they chose a character's behavior for Ms. Dewey that was not welcoming, not nice, not pleasant, not anything you would want to really encounter in person. She sort of prances around stage and she sort of humps, and she's very impatient and she's not very nice and she sneers and she's not an agreeable person to be working with. And then she's just a little video front end, because once you get your search results, it's still just a search page like you would find in Google, except it's white type on black background. So not only is this difficult, to specifically choose not to build something that would be agreeable or likable by people is sort of a courageous move, I guess, in their part. So those are examples where anthropomorphism is very difficult. We do have examples where anthropomorphism is more realistically rendered and more successfully rendered. This one from Knowledge Navigator, and again, this one's all the way back in 1987.
You have 3 messages. Your graduate research team in Guatemala, just checking in. Robert Jordan, a second semester junior,
That's
requesting
Phil.
a second extension on his term paper. And your mother reminding you about your father.
Surprise birthday party next Sunday.
Today you have a faculty lunch at 12 o'clock.
What makes Phil successful here is he's not too human. He's not telegraphing too much capability. Doesn't really have any emotion, doesn't have a lot of personality, is interruptible very easily. He has a bow tie, so he's a little bit out of fashion. Right? We don't have a lot of expectations about what it's going to be like to deal with Phil and what he's going to be able to do or not do, because he's really rendered very subtly and still within this sort of context of technology, because he sort of looks like an automaton. He's human-like, but not quite photoreal, etc. And that's why this works. And it's really quite amazing to think that this is, 24 years ago, they did a really good rendering that lasted almost a quarter century in terms of what personality, what guides, and what anthropomorphism might be like to use in the interface of computing systems. Moving along, we get really hung up around visual representations of people in terms of anthropomorphism. But a visual representation isn't necessary to get that sort of anthropomorphic effect. Sometimes sound alone is enough. Here's a good example from Next Generation.
Bridge to Commander Riker. Picard to Commander Riker. Answer, please. Computer, locate Commander Riker.
Commander Riker is in his quarters.
So the computer in Star Trek, in fact, all of the Star Trek series, is rendered as a voice. It's a voice response and natural language processing system. Now, it didn't have to be that. It could have been a bunch of lights and buzzes and beeps. It could have been a text interface. There's probably a lot of reasons for narrative use in terms of science fiction in both film and television, why it sort of works better as a character, as a voice within a story like this. But there's something else happening here too. So since the computer is rendered with slightly computerized but mostly human voice, the expectations from the audience are that this thing is more powerful than the kind of computers that we use. And this is part of the expectation of what the computer's capabilities are, how powerful it is, whether it has sort of artificial intelligence, etc. It's all promoted, and our expectations go up because of this humanistic voice. It's telegraphing that it's more like us than, let's say, a calculator. We see other examples of this. Here's one of my favorite. This is a little dark. Hopefully you remember this scene, right? And listen to R2-D2. Right? We all remember this. So R2-D2 is probably the most beloved character from Star Wars, probably one of the best acted characters from Star Wars. R2-D2 can't speak, and yet we got the fact that he was afraid. And it's actually kind of weird that R2-D2 can't speak because C-3PO can speak, but same time period, this droid can't, right? So R2-D2's entire personality, what he's thinking, what he's doing, what he's feeling, which is also kind of weird for technology, is coming through simply by sound effects, beeps and buzzes, and doing so very successfully for us. We see other examples of this. I won't take you through Knight Rider. We all know Kit. But so sound can carry this anthropomorphic effect, and it can do so very successfully. But even sound isn't a requirement for anthropomorphism to sort of come off and be successful. Sometimes behavior in the system is enough to do it. At least I contend that something like one click is actually an anthropomorphic experience for people, because essentially what the system is saying is, just click here, I'll bill you later, I know what your preferences are, I know you want it where you want it sent. This isn't so different than walking into your favorite restaurant or your favorite bar, and as soon as the bartender sees you, he's already making your drink and having it ready for you by the time you get to the bar. He doesn't have to take your money right away because he knows you're good for it, he has your information, he's seen you before. All of that complex interaction, which is really the basis of trust, is embodied in this one little click of a button within interface. So to me, there's something anthropomorphic happening here in addition to just the convenience of it, and it's doing so without sound, it's doing so without humanistic sound or humanistic visualization. So behavior can carry that. However, when you do play around with likeness and you make things human-like, you can get away with a lot. Good example is here, in fact, this isn't humanness. This is an interesting example. Since it's science fiction, we can play around with things like animals and aliens. This is from Until the End of the World. I don't know how many people have seen this. It's a fantastic film, 1991. And she's looking for her lover. And so she's hired a guy, and this is Bounty Bear.
He's getting
So I don't know if you heard that very well, but he sort of walks around. It's like, I'm searching, I'm searching, I'm searching. And especially and then he says, I got you at the end, right? Because he found it. This is just a search algorithm, right? It's just it's a sophisticated search interface that's going through a bunch of databases. But the fact that it's rendered on screen for us humans as this kind of bear embodies it with qualities, at least in terms of our expectations of how sophisticated the system is, or how capable the system is, or maybe how strong and speedy the system is, simply because of its representation. We see this all over science fiction, of course. This is a famous example from The Matrix.
You understand, most of these people are not ready to be unplugged. And many of them are so inert, so hopelessly dependent on the system, that they will fight to protect it. Were you listening to me, Neo? Or were you looking at the woman in the red dress? I was. Look again.
So, Agent Smith is an algorithm. He's a computer program. There's probably a lot of lines of computer program. But when he's rendered in the system as another person, he becomes that much more sinister, because he becomes that much more powerful and human-like. Even if Agent Smith doesn't have any emotions, our shorthand in dealing with other people or dealing with other sophisticated technologies or sophisticated interactions is to assume all these things that we've learned in dealing with human nature and people around us. So Agent Smith is rendered in this way, and in fact, incredibly high resolution, right? It's pretty much, in The Matrix, this is someone that's indistinguishable from another human. So we've crossed the uncanny valley at this point, and we're at that sort of perfect representation. And because of that, our expectations about what Agent Smith is capable of, in fact, he's superhuman, of course, because he can pop up in different places instantaneously, but his motivations, his abilities, his capabilities are all heightened in terms of our expectation. And then, of course, in this film, they all sort of come true, because he has those capabilities. He is superhuman because he isn't human. But all of that comes through in a way that wouldn't have come through if this were, again, a text interface or a speech-to-text interface or some other sort of non-human representation. And, of course, we see this, another example of this later in The Matrix when Neo visits the Oracle.
I know you're Neo.
This is a little faint.
You're the Oracle?
Bingo. Not quite what you were expecting, right? Almost done. Smell good, don't they?
Yeah.
I'd ask you to sit down, but you're not going to anyway. And don't worry about the vase.
What vase?
That vase.
So the Oracle is, again, another computer program. But because the Oracle is rendered as a person, and a person that's indistinguishable from other people in the system, as opposed to, let's say, a terminal, we as audience members, but also people in the Matrix, will change our expectations about, well, maybe she is, in fact, capable of predilections and predictions that come true, whereas we wouldn't necessarily make those assumptions, or we'd be more skeptical of them if it were a line of text, command line interface scrolling by in text, etc. So we see a lot of examples of this effect in science fiction. I imagine most of you are familiar with the Uncanny Valley. Is anyone not familiar with the Uncanny Valley? Okay, a couple people. So this is Masahiro Mori's, right? I got that right? Masahiro Mori's diagram about what happens. He has sort of familiarity on this y-axis, but I think how it plays out in terms of our understanding, it's more like acceptability. So as the human likeness on the x-axis gets higher and higher in terms of its humanness, its accurate representation at a high degree of resolution of a humanness, sort of the difference between what you saw with Phil, or better yet, maybe Bob, on one side, and on the other side is the Matrix, where systems are just indistinguishable from people. As you move along this x-axis, the familiarity, in this case acceptance of that character, grows until you get right around here. And what happens is, when you get too close to that representation but not close enough, people essentially look like, or systems look like cadavers. They get gross, they get uncomfortable and creepy, and that's where you have things like sort of corpses and zombies. You fall off this acceptability until, again, you get so accurate in your depiction that you shoot up much higher. And there's two things happening here. There's one graph, the top one, or the lower one is for still imagery, and the upper one is for moving imagery. So if the imagery is animation or video and it's moving, the effect is much greater both on the highs and on the lows. I would probably say that you could chart a third one here simply on behavior. So if the behaviors move from clunky and system-like to incredibly human, there is likely a point where things are too close to accurate behavior but not close enough to be indistinguishable, and it probably gets creepy again. And this is something that plays out in science fiction all the time. So moving on. Another way that science fiction is interacting or affecting the development of real-world devices is by proposing entirely new paradigms. So we saw in that upper sphere where design was influencing science fiction by playing off the paradigms that already existed. The great thing about science fiction is that it's fiction, and you can propose paradigms that haven't yet existed, and you can play around with them.
And again, whereas the social context reminds us that we're humans and when we have sort of fixed things that aren't going to change across technology, proposed paradigms where we say, hey, look, technology is going to change. Is this the right way to go? So we actually have sort of 4 categories of these things. They're examples. And what they are is sort of lessons and how those lessons relate to us both as designers and audiences. So this first one is a category of lessons that we've gotten that are well known by the design community already. So one of those is constraints ease learning curves. So the notion is that like bowling alley for kids is pretty good if you can pull those little rails up, right? It's sort of easier for them to learn. Once they get good, you can put the rails down again. That's a well-known principle in both industrial and interface design. I mean, we see examples that can act just like touchstones. Oh yeah, you remember that scene in The Fifth Element where they're sort of trying to trigger that millennium-old gun or weapon.
You got it figured out, Father?
This one should be fine.
You don't know how all this works?
Theoretically, yes.
Theoretically?
Know that the 4 stones should go around, the 5th element should be in the middle, and then the weapon against evil should work.
You've never seen this work before, have you?
No.
The weapon has a manual. I'm sure this has one too. That's it. Match up the symbols. Go, go!
So it's only the constraints of that system that allow it to be really easily used. Oh, a triangle object goes in triangle depression and patterns match. Sweet, that's a positive example. The next one we have is sort of a negative example, which is a short film called Lifted. And this is a great example, and I already hear the laughs in advance.
Everyone's seen this.
But it's of this little tiny alien who has to work with a system that has no constraints. And there's a view coming up. There's that poor kid looking at that system. Okay, and the problem, a lot of the jokes come from the fact that, you know, technology feels like this to all of us. But
we don't have enough interface jokes out there in the film world.
Yeah, and Pixar makes most of them. So this is a negative example of that same thing, you know, a lesson that everybody sort of already knows about how you deal with technology. Another one is that sort of lessons that might be known in the lab but aren't well distributed yet. In this case, its input should know the affective or emotional states of the user. This is a negative example from one of my favorite films, The Fifth Element. And in this scene, Cornelius is coming up to Zorg. You know what, I'm just going to let it sort of play out because it becomes apparent. Zorg has now choking on a cherry pit and asking for help. Zorg's evil.
Where's the robot to pat you on the back?
Cornelius doesn't want to help him. So of course Zorg doesn't really want these things to pop up and down in his office. But the system, if it were smart enough, would go, hey, wait a minute, that's not normal behavior. I'll call the guards for you. So that's kind of a negative example. The system's not aware of his emotional state and not responding properly. A positive example. Oh, the one I was staring at just went blue. Okay, a positive example comes from 2001. In this case, Dr. Floyd is having a video conference with his daughter back on Earth when he's on the satellite sort of orbiting. And the thing to pay attention to in this clip is
watch her
hands.
right hand.
I'm sorry, sweetheart, but I can't.
Why not?
Well, you know, Daddy's traveling. Very sorry about it, but I just can't.
Oh.
I'm going to send you a very nice present, though.
What?
Anything special that you want?
Yes.
What?
Okay, so I'm going to pause it right there. She begins in the scene to sort of mash on the keypad. Now, we know actually what was going on in this scene. It was Kubrick's daughter, and he just didn't want to cut it again because she was probably wailing at that point, or reshoot it again. But if we give them the benefit of the doubt, this is the way the system should work. It should recognize this is a 6-year-old girl. If we're in the middle of a conversation, her mashing on the keys should have no effect on the call, right? So it's sort of a positive, accidental example of something that is known in the lab. Hey, we should pay attention to a user's emotions and deal with it appropriately.
And in fact, some of the best lessons that we've come up with are in an attempt to apologize for stuff that we see in science fiction that doesn't quite make sense. What often comes out of it is a very usable example because it worked in the film. Yep. And if you can figure out the apology, you're left with an example that could work in real life.
Yep. Yeah, apology is one of our favorite exercises. Hopefully a favorite chapter in the book. The last section of this is stuff, so we've talked about stuff that's well known by designers, stuff that's known in the lab, and then there's stuff that sort of emerges from the science fiction itself. A lot of really interesting stuff here. In this case, it's the sort of lesson is that social hierarchy can play out in holography. You see, I'm going to air quote that in addition to screen quoting it because it actually should be called volumetric projection. I'm a word nerd. I can be sort of persnickety about that. But where this sort of plays out in science fiction is when we take a look at the use of volumetric projection in Star Wars. In this example from Star Wars 6, The Empire Strikes Back, we see Darth Vader talking to a volumetric emperor. Is it 5? Good catch. You know how many times we've presented and no one said that?
What is thy bidding?
You win an internet.
Stop.
So in this case, he's not looking at, well, let's just compare that then to the similar technology, but the use of it by the Jedis, the good guys.
Palpatine fixed General Grievous on Utapau. A partial message was intercepted in a diplomatic packet from the chairman of Utapau.
Act on this, we must.
So I'm going to pause right there, but you can see in the Jedi chamber, they take effect to show the participants at the same size, even though there's no real need to. And it sort of reinforces the underlying social hierarchy. The Jedis are equals. They're all equals, and their holograms are all equals. Whereas the Empire is a very hierarchical state, and in fact, you've got this giant head, who is the superior talking to the small fella. It actually sort of gets broken over the course of the film. There's one scene where it's not the AT-AT. What's the little chicken one from 6?
It's like the mini AT-AT.
Anyway, you see a little tiny Darth Vader talking to. Thank you.
This, right on. So what's interesting about this is that as far as we can tell from the production designers, this sort of scale hierarchy volumetric projection thing is used very consistently throughout all the Star Wars films. There are some exceptions and there's some exceptional situations, but for the most part it plays out, and we from what we can tell, it wasn't a design rule. It was done entirely intuitively. So it was something that they were trying to get by when they were telling the story that ended up actually sort of being a really interesting design rule that we can now use as a lesson. So any interface designer that's working with visual representations, it could be a web chat or Skype, it could be a webinar or iChat kind of interface or FaceTime. When you have more than one person projected or depicted, playing with scale automatically can either invoke or transgress social hierarchy inherent in who these people are and what their relationships to each other. So we can pull lessons out of situations like this that are completely usable.
So that's actually sort of the last lesson that we had, and there's a bit about intentional modality and gestural interfaces, but I want to check on where we are on time.
We have time for one more, I think.
20 minutes more.
Yeah,
20
exactly.
minutes more? Excellent, because I love Q&A, and this guy's going to correct us on a lot more stuff, so I want to get to that point. The last sort of lesson we have here is intentional modality and gestural interfaces. That's another giant mouthful, but it kind of becomes clear when we show you the example. So if you're not familiar with the Minority Report, only the most referenced science fiction film on the web, It involves a technology whereby John Anderton, a pre-crime cop,
You are running out of
scrubs through video of future crimes in order to find the location and prevent those crimes. To do that scrubbing, he uses a gestural interface. Here we are. I'd be shocked if you hadn't seen this film and you were actually attending this lecture. A scene...
For this program.
Yeah. A scene later, Anderton is introduced to investigator Whitwer, and it's sort of a little interface joke, not by Pixar, but where he turns to shake Whitwer's hand.
I got coffee. Thank you. Danny Whitmer, tween for the Fed.
Almost loses all of his work. Has to reposition and say sorry about that, right? We're not all using, we're using touch gestural if you have an iPad or iPhone, but for the most part we're not using in the air gestural interfaces right now. And this is something that they sort of discovered in the making of the film, but it's something that we're going to run into as we begin to design for gestural interfaces. You are in the control mechanism all the time. You can't escape it. You actually have to have a modality that says, now I am trying to tell you to scrub to the next bit in the video, now I am scratching my butt. And the computer needs to know the difference between those two things, and we have to have a mechanism. We don't know that because we're making gestural interfaces, but we certainly can reference this as a future vision. And they found it, they exposed it, and they confessed it. One of the nifty things about that movie that they didn't confess is that Tom Cruise had to take breaks every 5 minutes because holding your hands above your heart is exhausting.
Which is one of the reasons why gesture, everyone we talk to is like, can't wait for these gesture interfaces without realizing that these things are really tiring. Yeah. Not to mention the fact that you don't necessarily want to gesturally interact with Facebook or other kinds of modalities.
Or email.
So gesture is one of these special cases that may find, in fact, really great uses in certain specialized cases, but probably won't be a widespread technology in the same way that voice systems aren't a widespread technology in terms of voice interfaces for us, except for some specialized cases like in the car where it's appropriate. And one of the reasons for that is that everyone that's not at IBM or Microsoft is working often in a open plan office as opposed to getting your own office with a door closed. If you're in an open plan office, you don't want everyone listening to what you're doing on the computer because half the time or 30% of the time, you're not doing your work on your computer at work, right? You're Facebooking and you're doing all sorts of stuff. And once you use a voice interface for that, that becomes apparent. Not to mention the fact that you don't necessarily want to hear what everyone else is doing around you as well. So voice interfaces haven't really found a lot of uses in terms of widespread mainstream personal computing, even in work computing, because they have some inherent problems that work really well on screen, but have some real-world implications that they don't really work very well. Same thing with gestures. And this brings up one of the big meta lessons. So this is just a fraction of what we found. There's a lot of really good lessons coming out of this that we hope to publish in a book this year. But one of the meta lessons here that's really interesting is that if it works for an audience, it will most likely work for a user. And that's actually a really interesting case because that essentially frees us up and legitimizes science fiction as a legitimate prototyping and development environment or mechanism or process for real-world devices. In fact, there's a guy up at Intel, he's a futurist for Intel, his name's Brian David Johnson. He's written their book, Screen Futures on the Future of Television. He just came out with his new book on
this week.
Science fiction prototyping, and he's documenting where people all over the world in companies, not just in film and Hollywood, in companies are using science fiction as a prototyping and development process to develop real things, which is really interesting. So if it works for a user, it most likely works for an audience. There are cases where that's not the case, like where it's not true, like in Minority Report. But the reason why science fiction is becoming legitimate as a commercial development process is because, as it turns out, all design is fiction anyway. All design that we do, whether it's for in class or in a company, is a fiction until it actually becomes real and ships and is available to people. Knowledge Navigator is science fiction. It's called speculative fiction. It was made very seriously in Apple Computer, and it was thought through very seriously in terms of its interface capabilities, etc. But it was still fiction. Every bit as fiction as Minority Report was fiction. In fact, most of what you do in this program will be fiction. It won't be real But it's exactly the same design process you would use whether it was a film or whether it was, whether you're working in a company. And that's a really interesting thing to realize, is because, again, it legitimizes science fiction, because what we're doing already is fiction, and therefore that sort of opens up some of the tools and processes that we have available to us. One last thing about that is, once you figure out that science fiction is legitimate because all of design is fiction until it gets published, until it becomes real, most of business is fiction. And anyone that's ever worked on a business plan clearly knows that pretty much everything in it is fiction, especially the financial projections, right, where everything goes like this. And it doesn't mean that they aren't going to come true, or that it's not possible for these projections and all these plans to come true, but they are absolute fiction until they do. And so don't let any business person, especially the MBAs, I crank out more MBAs, so I think I can legitimately say this. Don't let MBAs tell you, oh, that's not real, or that's not legitimate, or that's not possible, because nothing they're doing is any more possible. They just have more numbers around it maybe, or certainly a lot more bravado around it. But everything that they do is fiction as well, at least in terms of a startup entrepreneurial context.
So that's actually the end of sort of the formal part of our talk. I guess we can go with the lights up again, show our handsome smiling faces, and open it up for any Q&A or corrections.
Yeah, corrections especially. Yeah, we've got about 12 minutes. Yes? Good.
A couple of things. So the minority report thing, you were presenting it, I don't know whether it was just you running out of time, but you know that comes from research work. So you have John Underkoffler at MIT, and then he's playing off in the Royal College of the Art, Marble Answering Machine by Daryl Bishop, and there's this whole chain of back and forth going on there. So it's just a nice example.
Right. And he was, I believe he was consulted in
he was
film, right?
He's actually in the credits.
Right. And in fact, we're finding among sort of serious science fiction directors, ever since 2001, a real desire to get it right for the serious sort of expensive sci-fi, where they'll bring in technologists, they'll bring in scientists, et cetera, so they can get it right. Whereas a lot of cheap sci-fi, they'll just do whatever, it's cool.
One last piece, just because we've just been doing research in this area, and did a thing on looking at Minority Report and using gestural interaction with a large screen or wall-sized display. And it turns out that the thing you were saying earlier about guided interfaces makes a huge difference. And in fact, if you're holding a device and it's guided, then you're far more efficient, it's far less tiring. So completely unconstrained freehand is in fact the least efficient and the most tiring. And as you get more and more constraints, it gets. So there is data now out there, and we can tell you how and why that is.
Well, and Chris just
research is being influenced by the science fiction, which is influenced by the research.
I'm going to ask for that afterwards, the citation for it.
Chris is writing the Gesture chapter, and he just completed a presentation that we gave 2 days ago at the Television for Tomorrow, or Television of Tomorrow conference, where he's breaking down what the pidgin language is so far developed in terms of what gestures are and what they mean. And one of the things that comes out of that that's really interesting is that it's very clear that gestures alone are not going to be a legitimate or a capable interface, that in order to do all the things that we need to do in computing, if that's a decent word to use here, they're going to have to be blended with other things, the same way that we still use command line interfaces for at least Word documents, right? Word processing. We have spreadsheet. Not everything is sort of graphic user interface, 3D revolving things on screen. And so gesture, as well as everything else, is going to be this melange of different kinds of interface techniques and effects in order to do what we really need to do. And that's where everything sort of interesting is. It's where it all meets that makes it interesting.
You mentioned that design as a whole is a lot like fiction. But do you see, though, a contrast in the intended goals? For example, like in fiction, you just have to make the artifact look cool or enjoyable to use, right? Whereas in design, industrial design or product design, you need to ensure that it's actually going to be usable in an everyday context or in its particular use case. Hopefully. Does that come across in any of the paradigm connections that you see?
It totally does. And in fact, one of the naughtier chapters we've written is about sex-related interfaces in science fiction. And Of course, the stuff that the businessman is doing, the stuff that technologists are doing, and designers are doing, and film is doing all serve different masters. And the particular master that you're serving will change the thing that you are sort of allowed to produce. So like when we look at communications, hey, that's free and easy. We can show thousands of examples of that in sci-fi. But sex, there's a handful, on the order of about a dozen, maybe 2 dozen. And it's partially just because it kind of conflicts with sci-fi. It stops the narrative to have to explain a sex-related interface. So yes, and part of our work is meant to pull out, okay, what are the particulars of technology in narrative that is different from stuff in the real world?
Well, and if you're familiar with the term expert design, where, we don't need any user testing, we know what's right, which has sort of been the history of Silicon Valley up until very recently, and still widely practiced. Film development and film production is essentially expert design. You might even bring in outside experts, but no, they do very little user testing. Now, studios will do user testing in the sense that they will have screenings and take into account audience feedback, but usually that's about the plot and sort of character development. Is usually not about interface. So we're not saying that this is the only way you should be practicing. I don't think we've found any examples of true user testing on the interfaces from film and TV.
Except where they leaked out, like the Jeff Hahn.
This is true, right?
Under Kaufler stuff.
And in the real world, we see really spotty implementation of true user testing as well. So that's probably the big division between the two. But and there's probably others. I mean, the fact that money is a bigger constraint and technology is a bigger constraint, obviously, in real world design than it is in science fiction.
And there's one other thought, is that we saw a difference in the, I think there were 3 categories that we identified in the role that the technology plays in the story. If the story is about the technology, it has a different weighting. If it is an enabler in the technology, like the doors in Star Trek, like nobody pays too much attention to them, or if it's background technology, like all the blinking lights that you see in the Death Star, they're given different treatments and different constraints.
And often constrained by production budgets, right? So we went from Star Trek, the original series, with all these glowing, brightly colored physical buttons and switches, and especially toggle switches. They didn't have the budget to recreate that on the bridge of the next generation, and so Michael Okuda and wife and production team had to figure out something cheaper that still filled all this space and looked complex and sophisticated and really cool. And so they just sort of printed translucent panels and backlit them, and then suddenly it looked space agey, and they literally invented a new aesthetic, but it was completely driven by their production budget. So you see some of that as well.
Quick aside, I actually had heard fairly recently that the reason you have the octagonal papers in Battlestar Galactica is that the director was insisting that the art direction crew cut corners, and so as a joke, they cut the corners.
I didn't know that.
And
that's great. There was another here.
So a couple comments. Most enjoyable talk. So first thing is, I don't see any blue glowing screens anywhere in your presentation, and probably that's the majority of sci-fi. So is it that the majority of sci-fi isn't really changing the way people think about things, and it's only these cases which occur once a decade which are changing the way we think?
I'm not sure I understand, because we did show at least one blue glowing screen, and our whole presentation is essentially one blue glowing screen. I think that part of this is the aesthetic. That's sort of an old aesthetic, and depending on how serious the director or the production designer wants to be about their film, it's a really easy trope to just sort of say, yeah, make it all blue glowing, and everyone gets that it's the future. If they're serious about it, they don't want to go there. They want to sort of create something new, maybe.
You talked about glowing is the main thing. You were turning down the lights, and I was looking at the back of your
head. Exactly. This is science fiction. Yes, and the other one.
Yeah, the other thing was that this is very Hollywood driven, and to me, I read a lot of sci-fi, and I find that a lot of SF writing has influenced a lot of technology. Yeah. I wonder if you found similar examples. So, for instance, in the Ender's Game, you have, or rather, in the sequel to the Ender's Game, you have the ear jewel, which is sort of like a Bluetooth headset, right? So there's a bit of that. So I was just wondering if your book also talks about that.
Yeah, totally. We don't address it, unfortunately, because our focus is on interface. We do have to look at visual, but we're both nerds and love science fiction literature as well. I just saw there was a video today I wish I could cite it, but I saw it like right as I was packing up my computer. But it was a really well done 3D rendering of a human face. And they cut back to the actor, and the actor had those sort of dots for motion tracking. And I immediately went back and said, oh, okay, Stevenson was right. Actors in the future are going to have implants. So yes, I'm almost certain that that's going to, yes, literature influences a lot. And in fact, I think because they don't have to answer the money gods as much, they're probably more often right than not. But when it comes to interfaces, they don't describe them in the detail that we can use them to evaluate.
It's very difficult for us to communicate to you or a reader or an audience what they're meaning, because what you see or imagine when you read it may be very different from us.
Yeah.
So we've just sort of stayed away from it for that reason. But by all means, game interfaces, anime, literature are ripe areas for ideas that you can incorporate into your work.
Great talk. I really appreciated the insights about the interaction between the technology and interfaces and the social context, like the empire hierarchy fiction. Now there's a lot of dystopian science fiction, and I just reread 1984, and it got me thinking about what if they did that film today, what it might look like to envision a ubiquitous surveillance kind of society.
I think it would just be today, right?
And London more specifically.
London and Chicago now, yeah, exactly.
So the question is, in your researches, if you came up with some more darker, sinister lessons that came out of the kind of dystopian visions.
Well, I think I was primed because I was talking about the sex chapter, but there's a really, Lucas's first film is called THX 1138, and is it a lesson? Maybe not, but in the sex chapter we distinguish matchmaking technologies from augmented sex technologies from sex with technology, and they have this horrible example of this guy, sort of the roommate, who sort of comes home and he's male.
Not unlike many college experiences.
oh, wow. What he's talking about is, so the roommate comes home and his roommate is in love with him and sort of is swapping out his medicine, and so that to sort of break the corporate spell that he's under. And then he sits down on the couch and this long device sort of comes down, and then he turns on the holographic television and he switch it to the dancing chick channel, and she's sort of dancing, she's topless and her breasts are sort of jiggling, and the device comes down, and of course you never see it below the actor's chest, but then you see the device sort of like going up and down,
undulating,
and down, and then like
it's very mechanical, by the way.
19 seconds later it retracts and he starts changing the channel again.
To sports.
To sports. And so there are lots of dystopian views, and we have to take those sort of with a grain of salt, because of course they're always meant to be sort of unusual or more of a narrative purpose than a, hey, look how useful this is. But I don't think I have a notion that I want to write a chapter on design for evil, but we're really constrained. Yeah. And the reason I say that is because science fiction is one of the only places in the world where you can design for evil and be open about it.
But I think that all of the lessons that we're finding can be used one way or the other, because they're just tools, right? So scaling holography or volumetric projections is essentially sort of an evil or dystopic implementation of a lesson, right? Or the poor alien there with the myriad, sea of toggle switches, that's essentially a dystopian interface. So I think all of the lessons have a duality to them, and should you prefer to go that way, that you could certainly go that way.
Yeah. Yes?
I thought, well, first the talk is really great. I thought it was interesting that one of the last points that you made was that, sci-fi can sort of be a prototyping kind of platform, because you can relate what audiences see to what users might want to use. And so I was wondering if you guys never explored kind of interfaces in video games, because interestingly there, the audience is actually using, think about Dead Space, for instance, you're using this kind of holographic interface, but you are actually using it to navigate your environment like the character.
Yes, we would love, I'm a gamer myself, just got L.A. Noire last night. But no, we're forcing ourselves just to stick, and even with the constraints that we've got, we're not done yet. We're both sort of terrified of Doctor Who, because it's going to take a month of our life.
For a lot of reasons, actually.
Yeah, it's going to take a month of our life. So yes, a subsequent book, or like if somebody else wants to sort of join us and run alongside and do video games, there is a play there, I'm almost certain.
Well,
and in fact, I've heard I mean, there's that old myth of the military sort of using video arcades to sort of find the best gunners.
Last Starfighter, right?
Yeah, Last Starfighter sort of came out of that myth, I think. So I think there is an influence there. We haven't touched it.
There's an issue there that's specific to games, and that is that in many games it's a little bit difficult to disambiguate the interface to the game and the interface in the game. And so we just decided, we already had bitten off more than we could chew. We'll leave that to a later, a later investigation. But there's definitely interesting stuff there.
Yep.
Probably our last one.
Okay. So I think other people would like to know which version of PowerPoint you're using here.
It's 1.5 actually.
And one small correction: the first clip you showed, you said the Voyage dans la Lune.
Yes.
It was by the Lumière brothers.
Lumière, yeah.
By Georges Méliès.
Ah, you are correct.
First invented special effects.
Exactly,
Right.
right? Exactly.
Thank you.
Lumière?
I did say Lumière brothers. Who invented film?
It wasn't a train coming at you.
No, it wasn't. Sorry.
Yes.
Now the question has, to me, a lot of science fiction looks incredibly predictable. The anthropomorphism of it, I think, doesn't help. And I think oftentimes it's done out of lack of imagination. So what is the most outlandish stuff you've seen?
The most what stuff?
Outlandish.
Wow.
We've never been asked this question. and it's a troubling question, not just because like we have to dig deep and say, hey, what's safe to be videotaped, but also because we're looking for patterns. So we run most frequently into the common stuff. And it's the patterns from which we derive lessons. The one where we don't is sort of the apology stuff, where we find something that appears broken, and in trying to solve it as designers, we come up to some sort of new interface paradigm.
To me, it depends on what you mean by outlandish, because that has a sort of negative connotation. We've found some really wonderful, very sophisticated, sort of rich stuff. The Cell comes to mind, and an incredible French film, which is not very well known here, called Chrysalis, which has this absolutely beautiful gestural work. But it doesn't have a negative connotation to me. So outlandish has a negative. There's probably actually so there is some really good things. So the clip we showed about Jurassic Park, where we find examples in sci-fi, especially in films, where specifically the director needs tension, and so they'll use the interface to build that tension. And the reality is, if it were a real system, that tension wouldn't be there. And so the Jurassic Park is a really good, and so in that sense it's kind of outlandish, where you can see it on screen. It's a three-dimensional sort of geographic interface to the controls in the lab. But that square is on screen. Just click on it, right? But no, it has to move closer to you before she can. And the velociraptors are coming in. So we see a lot of that kind of stuff where they break the interface in order to do something in the narrative that they want to do, or to heighten tension, or the story, or whatever. And to me, that's really outlandish, because you go to all that trouble to build one of these interfaces, or to use interface integrally to the story, and then you just sort of like ignore it and wipe it away because it's really convenient.
I thought of my examples,
Okay.
and they're all in one movie. It's Lost in Space from 1995. They look
Which is
really
a beautiful
exciting.
film.
They look exciting on screen, but the minute you stop and think about them, they're outlandish. I'll give you 3 examples. One is that there's one scene where the doctor actually has to open up the cryo tubes where the family is staying. To do so, he has to break a pane of glass. In other words, it's only usable once. Who designs an interface that's only to be used once? Like, once you come out of these cryotubes, you're never going back again.
Well, when you're isolated from the entire planet, like you can break the pane of glass to get to the fire alarm here,
exactly.
but you can replace it.
You can replace it. Anyway, it's crazy stupid. Another one is that when Will, the young Will Smith is sort of going with the family on board a dangerous spacecraft, but he's too young. So what they give him is he takes control of sort of the Robbie the Robot character, right? And so he's got this kind of telepresence interface where at first he's got this sort of little hand control where he controls the robot, and he's got a little video camera in the robot, and he can follow them around. Then the bad guys show up, and he drops the handheld control, and he jumps into a holographic image, and he's surrounded by this hologram of the robot. It's a really cool gestural interface, because to do things like to fire, he goes bang, 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 and you can sort of see something. But if you watch it slowly, there's a third laser on the robot, which comes out of the head of the robot. How does he fire that thing? It's impossible. And
He
I mean, as
blinks his
designers,
eyes.
we can think of ways it's gaze monitoring or AI, but they certainly don't lay any claim to it. And it just appears there. And what I realized is in watching it that I think the director just wanted another laser bolt in between these two, because Will couldn't move fast enough, and it would be more exciting if we had another laser. And the third one is, I know, you love the film, and I just like, makes me crazy. There's this great scene where, who's the daughter?
Penny.
Well, the older daughter.
Judy.
The older daughter, Judy.
I grew up with it.
Judy is sort of knocked out, and they put her on this medical table in order to take a look. It's really beautiful. This sort of 3D hologram appears above her and sort of sinks onto her, so it looks like she's translucent until you think about it. And the minute you think about it, you realize that that's only possible from a single perspective, right? If you went around to it'd be like one of those chalk drawings on a sidewalk, right? If you walk around to the wrong side of it, it would look completely wrong. And when you realize that, it only looks right for the camera. It must look wrong for everyone else. And there's like, it would work if it were augmented reality. We all have our glasses on, but there's no hint in the film that what we're seeing is augmented reality. So you want to see a ton of
I have to save this film's virtue or honor here.
Good luck.
And that'll be it. I'll just say that actually the thing I like about this film is that the interfaces in the film are always moving, they're always animated, so there's always this wonderful motion, and they're really beautifully designed. So from a purely visual standpoint, it's worth checking out this film. The one interface thing that I think is actually really wonderful, I've never seen it before, is one of the characters, I think maybe it's the father, I don't know, grabs a gun and speaks his name into it, and that activates it, right? So there's a voice recognition lock on the gun that I thought that was just a really sweet, credible moment that just goes by without most people noticing.
It's totally true. And in fact, like the sort of that notion that you've got this family constraint that's got to be family friendly is.
Right. Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.